These skeletons, 700 years old, are the remains of an epic battle between two samurai armies. Their injuries reveal the ferocious techniques used by a class of warrior with rituals and fighting styles unlike any other. The samurai. Cinema and martial arts have ensured their iconic status. And now, a mass grave of 3,000 warrior skeletons is casting new light on how the samurai legend was born.
Imagine what it must have been like if you're fighting with these.
Men were being cut down among the smoke and the flames.
The arrows penetrated into the brain matter. That's a lethal injury.
6 remarkable stories stand out. A landowner and his wife. A warrior monk. A foot soldier. A nobleman and his lieutenant. The samurai are back from the dead. 30 miles south of Tokyo lies the coastal town of Kamakura. Here, 10 years ago, builders digging the foundations for a beachside holiday complex made an astonishing discovery. They unearthed a complete skeleton. Then more bodies were found. Not tens or hundreds, but thousands. They posed a mystery dating back hundreds of years. Key skeletons were taken to Santa Mariana University School of Medicine near Tokyo. Here, the Japanese team dated the remains back to the 14th century.
発掘の体数としてはもう3000体以上で、でもすごい傷を負ってる人骨はいくつか出てます。
Forensic archaeologist Mick Wazocki is a specialist in analysing skeletons wounded in medieval battles in Europe. He's been invited to Japan to join the investigation into the Kamakura bodies.
At the moment, as far as I know, these injuries are unique to Japanese medieval skeletons. I haven't seen any similar kind of sharp force trauma, neither have my Japanese colleagues.
This skeleton exhibits cut marks 1, 2, 3.
Cut from behind?
Behind. Some very strange cut marks.
Yes.
Finish them off.
Finish.
Sharp force trauma means the wounds are the result of bladed weapons. The Kamakura bone pit, it seems, is some sort of war grave.
This is consistent with the features of cut marks by Japanese sword.
Katana. Katana.
The katana is the sword of the samurai. The weapon, the approximate date, and the sheer number of bodies point to one conclusion. The skeletons are connected to a major event in Japanese history. A bloody civil war fought by samurai 7 centuries ago. The story is told in a great chronicle of 14th century Japan.
We know a lot about it because of a chronicle that was written shortly afterwards called the Tai Heiki. The title means the Chronicle of the Great Pacification. It's one of the great war tales of Japan, full of brave deeds by samurai warriors. For 200 years, Japan had been ruled by the shogun, the military dictator. And the first shogun had relegated the emperor of Japan to a position of being a living god, but with absolutely no political power.
On one side, based in Kamakura, was the Hojo shogunate. At this time, the greatest power in Japan.
It was the Hojo family who had led the Japanese resistance to the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, one of the most glorious episodes in Japanese history.
Challenging their power was a new emperor, Go-Daigo, based in Kyoto. He was determined to bring the Hojo to heel and restore imperial power over the nation.
Emperor Go-Daigo was young, he was vigorous, he was brave, he was well trained in the martial arts. He wanted to rule Japan as his ancestors had done. And this young emperor raised an army of samurai and went to war against the shogun.
These two rival powers clashed with the utmost brutality in a 2-year-long campaign that climaxed in the year 1333.
1333 is a moment of great drama, because on one side you have the Hojo, and there's a family that's fighting desperately for their survival. On the other side you have warriors that had joined an emperor who was hungering for absolutist authority. Really, the Hojo had no choice. There's either to fight or to die.
Mikuzuki selects 6 bodies from the mass grave that look like they have the most revealing stories to tell. The first 2 are highly distinctive.
This is a very evocative assemblage. What we have here are 2 skeletons that were buried together in one grave. This individual's bones are much more slender, this individual is much more robust. So this is a male, and this is a female.
The Japanese archaeologists believe the location of the skeletons in the mass grave is evidence of the order in which they were interred. These 2 were buried separately, away from the mass of piled-up bodies, suggesting they were targeted in an early one-off skirmish.
We've also been able to determine that they're both of similar age, probably between the age of 25 to 35. Possibly they died pretty much at the same time, perhaps side by side. But this could be husband and wife.
Carefully placed, lying face to face, the man and woman are locked together as if in a lover's pose.
This individual's body has got very, very nasty and vicious injuries.
They are wound marks that closely match the unique signatures of samurai combat. The year was 1331. In Britain, Edward III was facing battle on 2 fronts with Scotland and France. In Japan, the Emperor's warriors closed in on Hojo samurai landowners, isolated in the outlying reaches of Kamakura. Historian Tom Conlon has studied pictures based on the Taiheki Chronicles that depict these assaults on Hojo landowners.
This image shows a night attack, and I think what's remarkable about this is because you see a depiction of a very intense encounter forcibly entering the house and attacking this family.
The Hojo living outside Kamakura were terribly exposed when samurai in the service of the Japanese emperor attacked on stealth missions.
We know that they didn't die in an accident because they have some very, very nasty and vicious injuries, particularly the male.
The ritual of a samurai duel now unfolded.
It's a very stylized, ritualized type of fighting, and very brutal as well.
The house was thought to be almost an autonomous area. The idea of protecting the house, I think, was a central thing to protecting these lands, so it had to be defended at all costs.
The landowner was not only fighting for his farmlands, he was defending his very way of life. The first wound was a katana blow to the Hojo samurai's left arm.
This bone is known as the radius. It's the bone that runs along this part of the arm and joins into the thumb. And he has a series of very deep gashes. This is sharp force trauma inflicted by a sword, and these are very heavy blows that have cut through soft tissue and sliced into the bone.
The wounds match the actions of a samurai trying to defend himself against katana attack. The sword slashes to his defending arm were not lethal, but he would now have to fight one-handed. Having weakened his opponent, the Emperor's samurai targeted the head.
This looks what I'd call overkill. You can see here a series of cut marks. He's had a number of blows to the top of the head, which again was part of the fighting style. It was quite common to rain blows onto the head. Again, none of these are going to be killing blows. They're going to cause a lot. They're causing a lot of damage. There's little bits of bones flying out as you're being struck. You know, you can be pretty concussed. Blood is going to be pouring down, but that's not necessarily going to be lethal.
Mikuwazaki believes he can isolate the final blow that ended the samurai landowner's life.
We can also see from the pattern of cuts, this final cut here, that pattern is reversed. So it looks very much as this individual, after a number of blows rained down onto his head, had perhaps turned around, and there's another blow that's gone to the back of the head.
The strike cut through the skull and into the brain tissue. It was the end.
You know, I mean, war is pretty brutal, isn't it, at the best of times? But imagine what it must have been like if you're fighting with these.
Full forensic examination of the landowner's skeleton exposes a cruel truth. It seems his valor exceeded his combat experience.
There's very little ante-mortem trauma. We would expect, if these were hardened soldiers who were paid to fight and fight and fight again, that many of them would have been through a number of battles, they would have had injuries which would have healed. So this looks much more like these were perhaps quite ordinary people who were then called to fight in a very desperate situation.
The muscle development on the landowner's skeleton reveals he worked the land, and this fateful duel may have been his first real experience of war. Samurai classes in medieval Japan were highly skilled swordsmen, but unlike the knights of Europe, not all were professional fighters. With her husband dead, his widow was next in line.
We've laid these out almost exactly as they were found in the grave. The key factor is they were buried in a condition which meant that their limbs were supple. That's going to happen in the very short period after death, before rigor mortis sets in.
It's evidence that the couple were buried within hours of their death.
They're placed very, very close to one another, hunched up. His leg has been moved to make sure that she can go in. He went in first. There's a kind of, very human and quite sad side to all of this. The female individual has had 2 blows to her head as well. Perhaps this woman was also fighting to defend her husband or defend the family or the homestead.
Her terrible wounds can't prove how hard or long she fought. What is known is that the samurai tradition upheld a surprising equality of the sexes.
One of the great untold stories of Japanese history is the involvement in War of Women. There aren't that many references, but the ones that are indicate that when the chips were down, the samurai women would fight every bit as bravely as men.
There was not the gender distinction that women were thought to be as civilians or non-combatants. If you were part of this warrior family, I believe that both men and women were in some ways almost equals.
They may not have been motivated in the same way by the loyalty to the clan or to the shogun, but they were defending their homes. And all women in Japan of the samurai class were trained in the use of weapons just in case.
With her husband dead, that time had come for this woman.
There's a sharp gash, but not quite cutting through, just about here, at the top of the head, very close to this suture. And another very deep gash here on the occipital bone. There's no healing at all, so we know that these blows happened very shortly before they died. So there's every intent to destroy these people.
The deep sword blow into the woman's skull resulted in massive brain trauma. 70 centimeters long and weighing 3 pounds, the katana blade cut through the skull and into the arteries. Like her husband, she died within seconds. "700 years ago, in feudal Japan, samurai were swordsmen who pledged allegiance to a lord or nobleman. They would lead their lives according to the strict code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. In return for their loyalty, the samurai were paid by their master and elevated above the class of commoner.
If you were born into the samurai class, then from a very early age you'd be trained as a warrior. A boy would perform his ritual manhood ceremony at around the age of 13.
In the samurai code, the sword was more than a weapon. It was an extension of the soul.
刀の中に神様の霊が宿って、それで自分の身を守ってくれる。
The katana is at the heart of samurai fighting culture, both ancient and modern. Master Tsunehiro Yamamuro's family were making swords in Kamakura at the time of the Civil War, 700 years ago.
本当の一番いい時の形ですよね。形がすごく綺麗です。
Today, he forges the steel blades using techniques that are unchanged through the centuries.
なんていうのかな、自分の身を守る道具ですから、それだけ鉄の超一流の品物を使わなきゃいけないということですよね。やっぱり不純物が入っているようなもので作ってしまうと刀は折れやすくなってしまう。だからそういう戒めを持ってあれを作る人間もなるべく綺麗な形格好ですね。
The craftsmanship of the medieval katana was far ahead of any rival weapon in the world. The end result was a blade that was sharp, light, and exquisitely balanced. The next skeleton chosen by Mick Wazoki has its own unique story to tell.
This is a very interesting skeleton, very enigmatic skeleton, buried in a single grave on his own. So that could suggest that there is something a little bit special about him. We know that he's broken his leg when he was much younger. We can see that there's quite a lot of curvature to it there. It's then healed, but caused this slight distortion of the bone. This bone is also significantly shorter than his left tibia, so he would have had a limp as he was walking.
His lameness may be a surprising clue to help identify who this man was. He may have been a monk.
Many of the people who were monks because they had some kind of minor disability. Therefore, they couldn't do other kind of work, and therefore they became monks.
Buddhist monks in medieval Japan were actively involved in warfare.
Some of them would have been samurai who had been ordained as Buddhist priests. This was quite common because of the great interplay between religion and warfare in Japan at the time. So we can envisage certainly warrior monks taking an active part in the Battle of Kamakura.
The bones of this monk reveal he died from battle wounds before he reached the age of 20.
This is what I would call a classic projectile injury.
A warrior monk felled in combat deepens the mysteries of the Battle of Kamakura and the samurai legend. Forensic archaeologist Mick Wazocki has found proof of a limp and a severe head wound on the third skeleton chosen from Kamakura Beach. Extraordinarily, it's evidence of a samurai monk.
It's quite interesting because a number of the historical texts and experts say that many of the young people who were killed in this battle were monks.
The Japanese scientists believe the young monk was buried during the second phase of the Civil War, as it escalated from just border skirmishes to bloody battles. In 1332, Emperor Go-Daigo's army advanced towards the Hojo fortress city of Kamakura.
The city of Kamakura was incredibly well defended by nature. On the southern side was the sea, and on all the other sides lay a ring of mountains, which cut it off completely from the outside world.
To get to Kamakura, the Emperor's samurai needed to fight their way through the 7 natural gorges that were the only route through that ring of mountains.
The paths are quite narrow, and if you look that they're, we would call them just like a hiking path. And you see that they're coming through a gorge, and you could have warriors that would be above there shooting down at them.
With the Battle of the Gorges, the civil war intensified and the casualties mounted up. Among them, the young monk.
This is what I would call a classic projectile injury. What you've got is a little bit of bone that's torn away at the base of this injury.
Illustrated chronicles of the time show that the monks played a unique role in Japanese warfare.
What's very interesting is there's the mindset of the time, which was that what causes victory in battle in a lot of ways was certain kinds of spells or maledictions or curses or whatever were thought to be very instrumental.
They would call down the wrath of the gods upon their enemies to bring them defeat, and that may well have produced some effect on their imperial powers, who were frightened that they were taking on these strange demonic spiritual powers, in addition to men who were armed with swords and spears.
This image is kind of interesting. It just shows you how the monks are here off by an altar and they're praying. You can see sort of how everyone outside, even the highest ranking nobles and all that, could not necessarily get to those areas. So they were kind of, secret areas. So it's kind of interesting, this idea that the first crucial military act would be to start having these curses, and they'd be performed for weeks.
The chronicles also record that armies of warrior monks fought on the battlefields.
In 1333, there's one temple in particular where they dispatched a force of monks to actually fight. They were the ones that were enacting this original curse, as it were.
There's a sort of V-shaped notch which looks very much like it corresponds to the edge of an arrow as it's gone in.
The historical scrolls painted at the time provide a unique record of the battles. One in particular is believed to portray the Battle of the Gorges.
I think this really gives a great view of just how probably the attack against the Kamakura went against the roads like this. It's a very, very informative image.
It shows how the Hojo samurai exploited the gorges to ambush the emperor's encroaching forces from above.
We notice that the battle is almost completely fought with arrows. But behind that, where there's an enemy's captured, we see that he's being stabbed with a pike and his head is about to be decapitated. So you could see the situation in which bladed weapons were used.
The Taiheki Chronicles tell of resolute Hojo fighters holding the emperor's army at bay.
The attackers pressed forward with fresh men, time after time. So great were their numbers. The defenders held stubbornly in many engagements, so vital were their strongholds. Thunderously, their battle cries and shouts on the three sides jarred the heavens and made the earth tremble.
The battle scar on the monk indicates that he was part of this fierce hand-to-hand fighting in the gorges. And his death suggests that by going in for the kill, he left himself exposed to the emperor's archers.
If I take this arrow, you can see where this leading edge will just come in. It's actually come in this direction. This samurai may perhaps, move it, trying to even dodge the arrow, so it's come in at an angle rather than coming in at 90 degrees. And because it's coming in at an angle, it creates this kind of elongated shape, which is a little bit wider here, and it's a little bit narrower at the top. And it's the force of the arrow coming in. It just pushes the bone in, and as it pushes the bone in, a little bit tears out here, and a little bit tears on the inside, and it creates that sort of shape.
The force with which the arrow pierced the young monk's skull is proof that the emperor's archers used their powerful bows as a close-range weapon.
And it's hit with a lot of impact, a lot of velocity. It's gone straight through the bone, and the arrow's probably penetrated into the brain matter, so that's a lethal injury. He's not going to get up and walk away after he's had that.
The arrow penetrated the skull, causing a fatal brain hemorrhage. Death would have been almost immediate. Despite such losses, the Hojo samurai prevented the emperor's army from breaking through the gorges. But the imperial forces had one final and potentially devastating card to play. Playing it would result in a massed pile of bodies on Kamakura Beach. One skeleton from that pile attracted particular attention.
This skull has got two injuries. There's a very deep gash running along the top of his head. But there is another blow to the back of the skull. Sword has come in and cut a slice right off.
The majority of fighters in the Battle of Kamakura were simple civilians fighting for survival. These foot soldiers armed themselves with their own weapons and armour.
The foot soldiers who followed the samurai into battle and served him probably outnumbered the elite samurai warriors by about a factor of 12 or even 20 to 1. So there were many more of them. And also their armour was much lighter. And particularly the great weakness in the protection afforded to a foot soldier was the lack of protection to the head.
The distinctive shape of the gash to the foot soldier's skull suggests he faced an even greater disadvantage. It indicates a blow delivered from above. And in the mass grave, they found evidence of how. horses.
Both injuries are to the very top of the skull, so it's possible that this could have been a foot soldier and somebody on horseback hitting him, and perhaps even as the horse was rushing past, the second blow has come in at an angle and created this slicing effect, rather than the normal kind of gash that we see on so many of these other skeletons. The injury to the top of his skull has all the characteristics of a samurai katana blade cut. It's got the length that's consistent with the length of the blade, coming in at an angle there.
The narrow gorges had been unsuitable for the Emperor's mounted samurai. But in the final stages of the Battle of Kamakura, an act of nature would unleash their devastating power. In the year 1333, an exceptionally low spring tide tipped the balance of the war.
The crucial moment in the fight to gain entry to Kamakura happened when the tide was far enough out to allow the Imperial army to go round the rocky cape that stretched out into the sea and effect an entry into Kamakura from the southern side, in other words, from the direction of the sea.
The retreat of the sea opened the way for the Emperor's cavalry to charge. Only a weakened Hojo army stood in its way. The sheer number of Hojo war dead suggests the final battle turned into a massacre. The foot soldiers' head wounds are not fatal, but evidence on the other bodies suggests how the fallen Hojo may have been finally dispatched as the battle turned into a massacre.
This is the left hip bone. There's a cut mark here. If we go over to the skeleton here, I can show you what I mean. So the cut marks are right inside here. We can see that the angle is actually coming in from above. So it seems likely he was lying on the ground and somebody was going past and just making sure that they were dead.
The katana blade, thrust through the abdomen and hitting the hip bone, caused massive internal hemorrhaging. This Hojo samurai bled to death in minutes.
It may well be some kind of coup de grace, which was routinely given to injured warriors as they were on the ground.
Chronicles of the time describe a sea turned red by slaughter.
Assuredly was this a battle to decide great things, one such as would make it known generation to come whether those who contended were brave or cowardly.
2 more skeletons from the mass grave will show how the battle ended. 2 final samurai selected for examination from the mass grave at Kamakura seem the most curious of all.
Both of them were decapitated with blows to the back of the neck.
Buried at the same time as hundreds of broken bodies and decapitated heads. These skulls were set apart.
We know that he's decapitated because we can see here on this 3rd cervical vertebra, there's a cut right through the body. It's very smooth, there's a very clear straight line. You can see that some sharp instrument, very likely a sword, has come through at an angle. The blade has come through from the back at an angle and has cut the 3rd cervical vertebra, so it's sliced that off as it's come through. That's classic decapitation. But it would indicate that perhaps the person may have been alive, may have been captured, may have been down on his knees with the head bent down, so that the sword can come in and very cleanly decapitate. If somebody's lying on the ground, it's going to be quite hard to do a really clean decapitation, whereas if somebody's kneeling down in the classic execution position, then the executioner can decapitate with one blow.
Heads of Hojo samurai were coveted war trophies for their victorious imperial rivals. Evidence of this macabre battle rite has been found throughout the mass grave. More than 500 skeletons were beheaded and dumped in the grave after their skulls were displayed on poles.
The best way to prove that you've disabled an enemy is to bring back their heads. Because if you have the enemy's head, then you can prove that this person is dead. I've seen other cases too where you see after like someone on horseback, if they had decapitated someone, they just have the head impaled on the sword.
But the two decapitated skulls under examination are not part of a mass group. They're buried on their own and with apparent care. So who are they?
These two skulls were found together. This is an older individual and this is a rather younger individual. We can see that because this skull, the cranial sutures, are fused together and are starting to obliterate and bones just growing over those, and that's a sign of a rather older rather than a younger individual. This individual is of a reasonably young age because there's very little wear to the molar dentition, which ties in quite nicely with some of the historical documentation, which says that often there would be a master or a senior samurai with a younger lieutenant, or somebody who is, perhaps in training to eventually take over this senior position.
The careful preservation of the skulls and their individual location in the grave suggest these two men are special.
It's been written that because people got credit for bringing in trophy skulls, but sometimes they would get skulls of people who weren't particularly prominent, and then they'd mutilate the face so you wouldn't be able to recognize it. But there's no sense of mutilation here, so these may actually be very famous samurai.
If these two skeletons were defeated Hojo samurai of high status, they would have attracted special attention from the Emperor's victorious forces.
This is where the stigma of being an enemy of the court was thought to be so devastating, because if you're then defeated, the ringleaders would have their heads decapitated. You can sort of see this whole process very clearly right here. This is the warrior. Here's the heads placed on the ground in front of the general, and the general sort of looking at the heads.
The two distinguished Hojo were doomed to ceremonial execution. The single blow of a formal beheading severed the spinal cord. Death was instant. The fact that the two skulls were taken as trophies, yet still placed in the mass grave, may provide rare evidence of a unique battle etiquette observed in medieval Japan.
There's one other tradition that's not generally known. Because of a very well-developed Japanese religious belief, certainly among the most high-ranking samurai, it was expected that the head would be returned to the family of the man who had been killed.
The execution of the Hojo samurai ended the Battle of Kamakura Beach. The city itself now lay at the mercy of the victors, and the Emperor's retribution was ruthless.
The Battle of Kamakura ended in a bloody, burning inferno. Almost the entire city was alight. Fighting was going on everywhere. Men were being cut down among the smoke and the flames.
Those Hojo not slain in battle or massacred in the pillaging of the city fled.
So, at the end of the Battle of Kamakura, the Hojo family withdrew to the mountains round the edge of Kamakura, and there committed the largest act of mass suicide in Japanese history.
One written account of the Taiheki Chronicle describes the moment of defeat.
I have heard that all the places of attack are brought down, and that Hojo kinsmen cut open their bellies in great numbers. I too desire to make known my loyalty by dying in advance of his lordship the governor.
In the aftermath of Kamakura, hundreds of Hojo embraced the samurai code and took the only honourable way out.
One of the best-known traditions of the samurai is the ghastly ritual of seppuku, which is to commit suicide by cutting your abdomen open using a sharp dagger. This was well entrenched in samurai history, and an example that every samurai knew he would have to follow in order to save his honour when he had been defeated in battle and death was certain.
With the annihilation of the Hojo shogunate, Emperor Go-Daigo finally stood as the undisputed ruler of all Japan.
The sudden transformation and the sort of overwhelming destruction of Kamakura is something you really see at no other time in Japanese history.
With the complete destruction of the Hojo family, Emperor Go-Daigo had achieved his objective. He could now reign as emperor just as his ancestors had done centuries before.
We tend to think of battles as places where there's great heroics, but there's also great human tragedy. And I think in studying all these types of injuries to ancient skeletons, it just reminds us what a very brutal and savage place the world used to be.
Inside Nature's Giants continues this Tuesday at 8. Engineered for speed, the team dissect an elite racehorse. But coming up, don't make excuses for him. If he's not calling, he's just not that into you. The movie on the way.